The monastery of Casaldora, perched on a quiet shoulder of the Apennine Mountains of northern Italy, was almost always wrapped in mist. In early mornings, pale clouds drifted between the cypress trees, like silent pilgrims searching for a forgotten sanctuary. Stone corridors, built centuries earlier by nameless monks, ran like solemn veins through the old cloister. If one walked them slowly enough, one could almost feel the pulse of every prayer breathed there across generations. To those who visited, the monastery seemed impossibly ancient, untouched by the rushing years outside. Yet time had not passed gently for every soul within its walls, least of all for the young monk who arrived at Casaldora with an earnest heart and a quiet longing. His name was Brother Marco Valente. He had entered the order at 23, leaving behind a troubled household marked by bitterness and silence. Marco rarely spoke of his childhood, and when he did, he described it only as a place without peace. The brothers of Casaldora welcomed him with kindness, believing that a wounded youth could be healed by humility, obedience, and prayer. Some even said they saw in his eyes a glimmer of zeal, a fire waiting to be purified. In his first months, Marco absorbed everything around him with an intensity that bordered on hunger. He memorized the rhythm of the bells, the psalms, the seasons, and the ancient chants sung by candlelight each dawn. He found a strange comfort in the fragrance of beeswax and in the sound of sandals brushing against cold stone floors long before sunrise.
Yet beneath that devotion, something restless stirred. The monastery was a place of silence, not just the absence of noise, but a deliberate quiet meant to expose the interior voice. Silence could transform a soul toward holiness. But for Marco, silence often became a mirror he feared to look into. Instead of peace, silence awakened old doubts, shadows from childhood, questions about God he had never dared to express. He studied Scripture eagerly, but privately tortured himself with contradictions. He prayed fervently, but experienced no light in return. Some brothers noticed a nervous tension in him, a subtle impatience during liturgy, a tightening of his fingers when the crucifix was carried past him. Still, Marco performed every duty assigned to him, cleaning the chapel, copying old manuscripts, cultivating the vegetable garden in spring. But his spirit did not bloom with the garden. Instead, an unspoken heaviness seemed to grow in him.
Casaldora was surrounded by deep forest, and sometimes, late at night, when all the brothers had retired to their cells, Marco would walk the garden paths alone. He would stare up at the ancient bell tower, its shadow stretching like a great watchman across the earth, and feel a strange, consuming loneliness no prayer could touch. He was drawn again and again to the small chapel near the refectory, where an old statue of Christ stood beneath soft candlelight. Many brothers prayed there quietly long after compline, seeking comfort from the wounds of the one who had suffered for them. Marco prayed there too, but instead of consolation, he began to feel judged, watched, not by Christ, but by the weight of a faith he feared he could never fully grasp. Those early months turned into a year, and still Marco found himself battling something unseen, a storm more violent than any wind that struck the mountain walls. Casaldora remained peaceful, but within Brother Marco Valente, a tempest was gathering, quiet, relentless, patient as nightfall. And the walls meant to protect his soul slowly began to imprison it instead. One day, that silence would break, but no one, not even Marco, could yet imagine how shattering it would be.
The chapel at Casaldora was not grand like the cathedrals of Rome, nor adorned with marble columns or glittering stained glass. It was small, almost modest, built of weather-darkened stone and warmed by centuries of whispered prayers. Its vaulted ceiling curved like a cupped hand over the wooden pews, as if the chapel itself sought to shelter its children from the storms that roared through the mountains. On the far wall hung a simple crucifix, a plaster sculpture of Christ crucified, its surface still faintly marked by the hands of the local craftsman who had shaped it only a few years after the Second World War. Though it was made of humble material, the figure possessed a strange dignity. The wounds of Christ were not carved with graphic realism. Rather, they carried a quiet sorrow, gentle enough to invite prayer, yet solemn enough to stir the conscience. The sculptor, an aging artisan named Raffaello Berto, had survived the war with eyes weary from the horrors he witnessed. Some said he poured into the plaster his own grief, offering it to God in silent reparation. Others believed he sculpted the crucifix in memory of his son, who never returned from the front. Whatever the truth, the crucifix became the heart of the chapel, a spiritual anchor for the monks of Casaldora. Every morning, after lauds, the brothers gathered before it. Their voices rose in slow Gregorian chant, Latin syllables melting into candle smoke as dawn crept through narrow windows. For many, this moment nourished the soul as bread nourishes the body. They looked to the crucifix as children look to a father, with dependence, with humility, sometimes even with love. But for Brother Marco Valente, the experience was more complicated.
He would kneel in the second row, just close enough to see every curve of the sculpted wounds. Yet something inside him resisted the silent gaze of that plaster Christ. Marco could not explain it, even to himself. He longed to feel what the others felt, the consolation, the belonging, the mysterious warmth that seemed to descend on the brothers during prayer. But instead, the crucifix felt like a mirror, reflecting his doubts. It was as if Christ's painted eyes were not filled with compassion, but accusation. Some evenings, after the monastery bells fell silent, Marco would return alone to that chapel. In the flickering glow of a single candle, the crucifix seemed almost alive, casting a tall, trembling shadow against ancient stone. Marco would stare at it for long moments, searching for something, anything, that resembled faith. But the more he searched, the more distant God seemed. Marco felt trapped in an image he could not touch, an image constructed by others, held before him like a promise he was somehow unworthy to receive. There were nights when he pressed his hands together fiercely, whispering prayers until his throat ached, begging for a sign. Other nights, an anger he never understood swelled in him at the sight of the crucifix, an anger born not from hatred of Christ, but from his fear of never truly knowing him.
For Marco, the statue was not a comfort. It was a reminder of everything he could not feel. Some brothers sensed he was troubled. They saw him linger after Compline, kneeling long after the candles burned low. But none guessed the depth of the struggle raging inside him, nor the layers of guilt and confusion that slowly suffocated his spirit. They assumed his silence was devotion, but for Marco, silence was becoming a battlefield. And always at the center of that battlefield stood the crucifix, still, silent, unchanging. If one listened closely in those late hours, when only the mountain wind brushed the chapel walls, it might have seemed that Christ's plaster lips were whispering something. But Marco heard nothing, not comfort, not forgiveness, only an aching emptiness. He wished the crucifix would speak, or at least Stop watching him. One day, when light was fading through the chapel windows and the cold of winter pressed close around the walls, Marco felt something inside him shift, softly at first, then with the weight of something falling. It was a feeling he could not name, but soon that feeling would burst into an act no one in Cazaldora could ever have imagined. The quiet tension building inside Brother Marco Valente did not arrive like a sudden storm. It gathered slowly, each day adding another grain of doubt, another drop of restlessness, until his soul felt like a vessel filled just enough to tremble at every touch. What had begun as a subtle discomfort during prayer gradually grew into suspicion, then irritation, then something far more dangerous. He questioned every sign of grace the other monks claimed to witness. When they spoke of inner peace, he secretly wondered if they were lying, to one another or to themselves. When they knelt before the crucifix with tears in their eyes, Marco felt a flicker of resentment twist in his chest. How do they feel something I cannot? What have they been given that I never will? Soon, even simple liturgical gestures provoked unease. The incense burned too thickly, the Latin hymns echoed too loudly. The crucifix itself seemed to accuse him silently with every passing hour. He began avoiding the chapel during the quiet moments between prayers, but no matter how far he fled within the monastery, the image haunted him like a shadow stretched from candlelight, always following, always returning. Marco told himself that perhaps the statue was merely a symbol, just plaster, just craftsmanship. But that belief brought him no peace. Instead, the crucifix became a reminder of everything he feared, the possibility that faith might not be real, that grace was only a beautifully crafted illusion, and that his entire life inside those stone walls was built on a foundation that would crumble beneath him. Day after day, doubt tightened around him like a rope, until eventually it became anger, deep, irrational anger, aimed not at Christ himself, but at the image that pretended to contain him. Then came that night. Silence lay thick across the monastery, deeper than any Marco had ever known. The moon drifted behind heavy clouds. The cypress trees outside stood unmoving, like sentinels carved from the night. Marco's steps echoed down the long corridor, as if he were walking not through a building, but through the hollow of his own chest. He pushed open the chapel door. A single candle flickered before the crucifix, its small flame fighting the darkness. The statue loomed above him, quiet, patient, unmoved. Something inside Marco snapped. It was not sudden rage, but a slow eruption, like the ground breaking open after years of hidden pressure. He crossed the chapel, his breath uneven, his face hot with fear and fury. In the corner, near a maintenance shelf, hung a small iron hammer used for repairing woodwork and broken hinges. Without thinking, Marco reached for it. He turned toward the crucifix. His heart thundered. His hands shook. "No more," he whispered, though no one was there to hear him. Then the hammer rose and fell. A sharp crack split the silence like lightning tearing open the sky. The plaster shattered, scattering white fragments across the stone floor. A second blow followed, louder than the first, as if the chapel itself gasped in horror. Marco froze. The hammer dropped from his hand. The chapel echoed with a ringing that seemed impossible for such a small instrument, an echo that felt less like sound and more like accusation. He stared at the broken pieces of Christ's face, lying like small white bones at his feet. His breath vanished. His knees weakened. A cold wave of realization swept over him, drowning the heat of anger and sudden terror. What have I done? He staggered backward, unable to tear his eyes from the ruin he had created. Yet instead of falling to his knees in repentance, Marco turned and fled, his pride and shame sealing his lips. He told no one. He confessed nothing. But from that night forward, silence in Casaldora would never again be just silence. Something had been broken that no hammer could repair, least of all Marco's own heart.
The morning after the destruction of the crucifix, Marco rose with trembling limbs, unable to look at his own reflection in the washroom mirror. Every beat of the chapel bell echoed inside his skull like judgment, yet no one questioned him. The brothers simply assumed his silence meant devotion, not torment. But something in him had shifted irreversibly. He avoided the chapel entirely at first, pretending to be occupied in the garden or cloister. When obliged to attend prayer, he arrived late, sat in the back, and kept his eyes fixed on the floor. If another brother passed him in the corridor, Marco turned away quickly, pretending to study the stone walls or the worn floor tiles. Any accidental eye contact struck him like accusation, and he withdrew even further into the shadows of the cloister. Every step inside Casaldora now felt heavy, like walking through a dream from which he could not wake. His nights were restless, filled with fevered thoughts. The sound of plaster shattering, the image of broken limbs on the chapel floor, the memory of his own voice whispering, "No more." Guilt pressed on him like cold iron. He knew he should confess, run if necessary to the nearest confessional and cry out for forgiveness. But pride and fear held him captive. The idea of naming his sin aloud terrified him. What would the brothers think? What would the world think? More than that, what would God do? Marco convinced himself that perhaps God already knew, and that silence might somehow hide the crime from human eyes. But it did not hide it from his own conscience. Every breath burned. Every prayer felt like poison in his throat. It did not take long for his body to react to what his soul refused to carry. One night, only a week after the act, Marco woke drenched in sweat. His heart pounded violently. A fever consumed him so quickly that his thoughts dissolved into a blur of confusion. He staggered from his bed, dizzy, clutching at the wooden frame to keep from collapsing.
The fever rose higher the next day. His skin burned as though fire had taken root beneath it. He could hardly swallow water. His vision flickered, walls twisting like dark silhouettes around him. Breathing became a battle. Each inhale scraped like gravel against his lungs. The brothers assumed he had caught a sudden illness, one of the seasonal fevers that occasionally swept through the mountains. They prayed near his door, whispering words of comfort through the wooden panels, never realizing that Marco's suffering ran deeper than any sickness of flesh. During bouts of delirium, he whispered fragments of confession, but always under his breath, half-conscious, never clearly enough for anyone to understand. Pride still rose in him even then, clinging to him like a dying animal refusing to release its last breath. And so, no priest was called for confession. No brother heard his sin. Late one night, Marco began to tremble violently, his body shaking as though some invisible force pulled him toward a darkness he could no longer resist. His breath came in desperate gasps, his fingers clawed at the thin blanket. No voice answered his cries, not even his own. With one final convulsion, his body tightened, then suddenly went still. His eyes, wide with fear, stared at the ceiling, as though seeing something terrible just beyond human sight.
Marco Valente died alone in his narrow cell, without absolution, without a priest, without the sacred words of forgiveness. No gentle hand closed his eyes. No voice prayed the final rites aloud. Only silence remained. Yet silence was not enough to contain what followed, for even as his body grew cold, something unseen stirred within the room, a lingering presence torn painfully from flesh. A soul burdened by unconfessed sin does not slip peacefully into eternity. It clings, trembles, cries out where no living ear can hear. And as night deepened around the monastery of Casaldora, Marco's soul departed, but not into rest.
Marco Valente's death passed to the monastery like a shadow that no bell announced. The brothers buried him in the small cemetery behind the cypress grove, where rows of modest wooden crosses watched over countless monastic generations. His grave bore nothing more than his name, his year of birth, and the simple inscription, Servus Dei. No one spoke openly about his final days. No one asked why he had grown so distant, why fear seemed etched into his last breath. But the monastery kept records. They always had. Father Mauricio, the prior of Casaldora at the time, maintained a detailed journal, a habit passed from prior to prior for centuries. In his neat handwriting, between notes about crop harvests and liturgical schedules, he wrote a short entry dated March 17, 1949. Brother Marco passed late last night, illness of sudden onset. We entrust his soul to the mercy of God, which alone can judge a heart known only to the divine. Another document, sealed in the prior's correspondence, contains a more cryptic sentence. There were spiritual concerns unspoken, yet urgent. The sentence ends abruptly, with a long dash, as if the pen hesitated over what it feared to confess.
Weeks later, the broken plaster crucifix in the chapel was quietly replaced by another. No official note recorded the reason, yet a handwritten repair request exists in the maintenance ledger. Replacement of devotional sculpture damaged by unknown accident. Unknown, yet someone knew, and someone could not bring himself to write the truth. Years passed, decades followed. Casaldora slowly emptied as vocations dwindled. Eventually, the monastery transferred all its archival materials, journals, property documents, and spiritual records to the Diocesan Historical Archive of Parma. The box containing Marco's file remained sealed with the ordinary twine used for minor clerical materials. Nothing about it suggested extraordinary importance. Until the late 1990s, when a diocesan research team began examining cases of so-called urging souls, spirits reported to appear requesting prayers or intercession. The project was partly academic, partly pastoral, initiated after a series of testimonials from elderly priests claiming unusual nocturnal encounters over the years.
Among the archival listings, one file caught their attention. Valente, Marco. Death, 1949. Irregular death. Reference chapel notes. Sealed correspondence. Inside they found the original journal entry, the maintenance ledger note, a letter from the prior, 2 testimonies written years later, and a fragile sheet containing faint penciled annotations: broken crucifix, unrest, request for masses unspecified. More astonishing still, they found a short confidential memorandum written in the 1960s by Father Aurelio Bassetti, a diocesan priest then in his 70s who had once visited Casaldora during Marco's final illness. The note appeared to have been dictated shortly before Father Aurelio's own death. On the night following a feast day of Our Lady, beneath the full moon, I perceived a presence in the cloister after Compline. I cannot testify certainty, only what conscience demands. The figure resembled the young brother Marco, though he had already departed this life. He spoke no words, yet sorrow encircled him like fire. This testimony had never reached formal ecclesiastical process. It sat quietly among unclassified materials, neither condemned nor approved.
Another witness statement came from Sister Giuditta, a nun from a neighboring convent who often attended retreats at Calzaldora. Her account reads with trembling handwriting. The old Father Aurelio once confided to me that the soul of a certain brother begged urgently for remembrance. He wept when speaking of him, but would not reveal details, only that the young man had died without peace. The researchers, trained in historical methodology, treated the documents cautiously, yet even with academic distance, they noted recurring themes: profound remorse, unconfessed guilt, request for intercessory prayer, spiritual unrest connected specifically to the chapel. One researcher, Professor Elena Sartori, wrote in the margin of her typed report, suggests unresolved spiritual conflict, lack of formal confession, possible theological implication, absence of sacramental reconciliation may contribute to perceived unrest. This line, formal and clinical, hides a chilling implication that Marco's soul may not have been fully reconciled at the moment of death. A final page in the file, likely added during archival reclassification in 2001, sums up the entire dossier in one stark line. The depth of remorse indicated a soul seeking release, but bound by unfinished penance. No more is written. No explanation given. The file ends, abrupt, incomplete, just like Marco's earthly life.
The decades passed. Marco had been gone for more than half a century, and life inside the ancient Franciscan walls moved forward as though nothing particular had happened. Brothers came, vowed, worked, aged, and died. The small chapel was renovated twice. The plaster statue that Marco had shattered was eventually replaced by a wooden crucifix carved in a modern style. Time erased whispers, at least on the surface. But there are some stories that refuse to die. They lie dormant, like embers hidden beneath ashes. In the late 1990s, a diocesan research project in Apulia began gathering records relating to unusual post-mortem testimonies, accounts of souls requesting help from the living through dreams, apparitions, or interior locutions. The purpose was not sensationalism. Rather, it was theological anthropology, a study of penitential imagination in Catholic spirituality. Among the archival documents, buried between routine death notices and disciplinary memoranda, was a folder labeled simply Marco, 1948. At first, the papers appeared ordinary: medical notes, dates, names of attendants. But near the end of the folder, investigators found a 5-page handwritten narrative from a senior nun, dated February 1950. Her handwriting trembled across the paper. He appeared after Compline, the face pale, the eyes begging. He said, "I broke him, and then vanished." She had reported the incident privately to a now deceased confessor who advised silence,
fearing scandal and superstition. And so, the testimony remained sealed for decades. During the review, a young theologian named Father Luca d'Armini became particularly interested in the document. Unlike others, he did not dismiss the account as mere hallucination or convent rumor. Luca had spent years studying mystical intercessions connected to Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, the Capuchin stigmatist known for assisting suffering souls. Padre Pio had died in 1968, canonized later as Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, but his intercessory reputation remained vivid among clergy and scholars. Hundreds of testimonies cited his encounters with souls in purgatory during his lifetime, souls begging him for masses, for prayers, for deliverance. Luta asked himself, could Marco be one more such soul, simply overlooked, simply waiting? He wrote a formal letter to the Capuchin postulator responsible for assembling and examining supernatural reports related to Padre Pio's legacy. Along with the letter, he prepared photocopies of the archival pages, the nun's testimony, the brief medical report, and a small marginal note written by a prior. May God have mercy.
Though the content seemed modest, the implications were weighty. Here was a man who had committed a symbolic act of sacrilege, not merely breaking a statue, but violently rejecting the presence the statue represented, yet died before confession, before reconciliation. The theology of purgatory teaches that even forgiven sinners may undergo purification for temporal consequences of sin. But what of those who never asked for mercy aloud, yet carried remorse inwardly? Luca's letter asked exactly that. His request was unembellished, respectful, almost timid. I beg humbly that the Capuchin community at San Giovanni Rotondo include in their next intercessory prayers a remembrance of Brother Marco, whose soul, according to ecclesial testimony, appears still in need of peaceful rest. The Capuchins did not dismiss the request. Padre Pio's order, accustomed to receiving spiritual petitions from every corner of the world, followed a quiet internal procedure. The letter was logged, the photocopies archived, and a note added that special Mass intentions could be offered if circumstances warranted. Yet something unusual happened. 2 weeks later, Luca received a short handwritten reply from an elderly friar, Father Benedetto, who served for years at the shrine associated with Padre Pio's ministry. The letter read simply, "We acknowledge your request. We propose an hour of prayer and Benedictine psalmody offered for the intention of the restless soul of Marco. May his repentance, though late, be embraced by divine mercy." The wording was careful, theological, and non-sensational, but to Luca it was astonishing. Padre Pio's community had accepted Marco into their intentions, as if recognizing a soul who had finally spoken loudly enough through time to be heard. The prayer hour was scheduled for a Thursday evening during adoration, just before the Capuchins extinguished the chapel lights for the night. No announcement, no ceremony, no dramatic declaration. Just quiet intercession offered on behalf of a man whose memory had nearly vanished into dust. Still, those present later said something felt different, as if someone unseen had finally breathed a long, trembling sigh.
Only a few quiet weeks passed when another unexpected document arrived at San Giovanni Rotondo. It was not an official request, nor a theological commentary, nor even a personal note from clergy. It was a single sheet of thin paper folded twice, sent with no return address, no signature, and postmarked from a small town in southern Italy. The handwriting trembled across the page, almost as if written by a person in physical distress, uneven,
wavering, stopping and restarting several times. The letter stated that on the night of June 2nd, the feast of a martyred saint in the Roman calendar, a solitary candle had remained burning before the small side altar where Padre Pio once prayed. In the late hours, a figure was seen kneeling there, motionless, head lowered, as though weighed by sorrow. The anonymous writer described a sensation of deep repentance in the air, followed by a whisper, barely shaped into words. Marco Valente. No title, no explanation. All that remained was a brief plea, written almost like a confession. Forgive me, I broke the sign of him. And beneath that, thank you for praying. The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had run out of strength or courage. It offered no theory, no attempt at persuasion, only an impression that someone or something had knelt where Padre Pio once battled unseen darkness on behalf of souls. The friar who received the message quietly placed the letter in the archival file opened weeks earlier, now labeled Marco Valente. Later, he noted only 3 words in the margin. A trace remains.
Years later, the quiet hills around Casaldora witnessed yet another renovation of the monastery. The small chapel was freshly painted, the pews repaired, and a new crucifix, carved from olive wood, was placed where the old plaster statue had once stood. Visitors admired the craftsmanship, unaware of the story buried in the archive. Some of the elder brothers, however, remembered, and every so often, especially on cold nights when the chapel bell tolled the late hour, they claimed to hear a gentle breath drift through the sanctuary, as faint as candle flame exhaling in darkness, a sound not of fear, but of prayer. No one spoke openly about it. No reports were filed. Life continued with the regular rhythm of monastic hours. But the brothers who had prayed for Marco would sometimes pause, bow their heads, and whisper a simple plea, "May he rest." In the end, the story closes not with terror, but with mercy. For even the gravest act, shattering a sacred image, cannot imprison a soul forever if remorse is true, if holy intercession rises on its behalf, and if the boundless mercy of God answers with quiet compassion. Some sins echo, but so does redemption.